Think back to the last time you watched a nature documentary. You probably recall epic chase scenes and battles between different species of animal, one being a predator, one being their prey. Oftentimes, you'll see carnivores pick off the weak, the sick, the old, the young, and the slow. Those animals that are most vulnerable, unable to fight back, only ever going for tougher targets if they have strength in numbers, or if they're truly desperate or suicidal. These films help teach us one clear and consistent lesson about the laws of nature, which should be obvious to all. Namely, the idea that predators don't like armed prey. Speaking of predatory laws, a perennial issue we see time and time again in this country is that of gun control versus the right to bear arms. Many bad arguments are made on either side, and I put it to you that the reason this debate continues is because both sides are speaking past one another. The gunphobes are generally better at weaponizing pathos and making appeals to emotion, particularly when minorities or children are involved. They tell a better story, a more viral story, and that is to their advantage since human beings are wired to be persuaded by emotion, whereas pro-gun advocates tend to argue in terms of facts and statistics, which are boring and fall flat, even if they're perfectly true. What supporters of the right to bear arms need is a better story, ideally a true story, spoken in the language of the progressive postmodern left, appealing to their sense of justice, fairness, and compassion. Towards that end, I put it to you that gun control is, at its core, fundamentally a racist policy. I'll say that again, because it's an argument you've likely never heard before, but one which is perfectly true. Gun control is racist. Some of you might have doubts about that, especially in lieu of all the white supremacist mass shooters and the killing of blacks, Asians, and other ethnic minorities that you see reported on TV. However, this is only a fraction of what our country has been through, and you have not been told the true history of the United States, because the truth would shock and horrify you. Not into giving up your guns, mind you, but rather in stocking up once you realize who the true enemy is and has been this whole time. That once you see how the fox has been guarding the henhouse, you'll have a change of heart about the necessity of individuals to be well armed. I invite you to walk with me as we tour some of the origins of gun control in this country, and by the end, you will no doubt come to agree that every major attempt to limit the right to bear arms has indeed been in the service of oppression and bigotry. Take your mind back to the late 1860s, during the Reconstruction era, a period I'm sure you remember quite vividly from what it was taught to you in school. The Civil War had just ended. The newly formed Republican Party had recently passed the 13th and 14th Amendments, effectively ending the practice of slavery in America and granting equal protection under the law to all those born in the United States. Newly freed blacks were beginning to find their footing in this country amidst a culture of white supremacy. The Confederacy had not only lost the war, they had been utterly devastated. Entire cities razed to the ground, their slaves liberated, and much of what property remained in their estates was turned over to former servants as a form of reparations. That is, to those still living who'd been actual direct victims of slavery in the raw, which is a story for another time. Suffice to say, the South had not only been thoroughly embarrassed, but impoverished as well. They had nothing left to their names, really. On top of all these new laws they were now made to follow as a conquered people. They blamed the burgeoning GOP for this humiliation. Thus, in 1865, Southern Democrats founded the first wave of the Ku Klux Klan. Their aim was to overthrow the Republican Party and reclaim the South for themselves, using tactics such as voter suppression, intimidation, and the targeting of African American leaders. You know, that whole "the South shall rise again" thing. History will record that the first iteration of the Klan was largely defeated and suppressed in 1871 by federal efforts. However, that same bitterness and resentment still permeated among Southern Democrats. On Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, an armed white Democrat militia attacked a group of black Republicans in Colfax, Louisiana, who had gathered to protect the district from Democrat takeover. This incident has since become known as the Colfax Massacre. Despite some of these black Republicans being armed and initially defending themselves, it's estimated that as many as 280 of them were slaughtered, with most of them being killed only after surrendering, and another 50 were imprisoned that same night. This massacre followed shortly after the highly contentious 1872 gubernatorial election, in which both parties claimed victory, in an atmosphere that should feel eerily familiar to many of you watching right now. Racial and political tensions were the highest they've ever been. As you might expect, some members of this white supremacist mob were arrested and charged with, among other things, violation of the black freedmen's right to bear arms. This case eventually made it all the way up to the Supreme Court in the now infamous 1876 landmark case of United States v. Cruikshank, wherein the court overturned the convictions of these racist murderers. The SCOTUS declared that individuals could not appeal to the Second Amendment in defense of their right to bear arms when said right was being violated by anyone other than the federal government. A true enough statement from a legal standpoint, but the fallout of this acquittal would echo for generations and be used as a scapegoat for further acts of racially motivated brutality in the dark days that followed. One of the arguments used by the white appellants in defense of murder and restricting black gun ownership should send chills down your spine. These racist Democrats argued that the right to bear arms, as outlined in the Second Amendment, doesn't apply to individuals, but only to a well-regulated militia in service of the state. Does that not sound eerily familiar to the arguments made by modern Democrats, who try to claim that the Second Amendment only applies to the militia? That individuals don't need guns because the police and the military will protect you? The same police and military whom they turn around and claim are racist bastards, evil colonizers, and tyrannical fascists? Never mind the fact it's called the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Needs, and that the only reason anyone should ever need to own a gun is because I want to, and I can. Of course, the militia that kicked off the Colfax Massacre was composed of these same white Southern Democrats, so their interpretation of the law was conveniently self-serving, and also excluded their black victims. In this way, they literally got away with murder. Effectively, the white racists were upset that their slaves had been freed and made their equals, and that some of these black freedmen might wish to defend themselves with guns, so as not to be recaptured and forced back into bondage, or to be condescended to as being inferior. Some might have even sought to take the lives of their former masters, who so thoroughly abused and oppressed them. And would anyone blame them if they had? Yet to their credit, most blacks were surprisingly peaceful and forgiving, certainly more so than their former masters. That white supremacists would want to disarm black freedmen should come as no surprise, as the Southern Democratic Party was initially formed for the purpose of defending slavery. I guess things haven't changed much, as racist Democrats still want black individuals to be disarmed and put back on the plantation. This time a voter plantation and a welfare plantation. To remove their rights and dignity, and make them wholly dependent on the government for their protection. which of course is oh so trustworthy, right? While the judiciary is normally the least corrupt branch of government, the Cruikshank decision remains a blot on the Supreme Court's record, and would go on to create judicial precedent for decades to come. It wasn't until 1966 that the Supreme Court ultimately started to reverse the Cruikshank decision in United States v. Price and United States v. Guest, and later still in 2008 with the now famous Heller Landmark case, which reaffirmed Americans' right to bear arms independent of their service in a militia. But by then, the damage had already been done, and we're still paying for it to this day, both literally and figuratively. This precedent set in Cruikshank helped pave the way for white democratic takeover of many local and state government positions in the South. After all, if they could get away with disarming and murdering blacks once before with the blessing of the court, what was stopping them from seizing power and doing just that again and again and again? Having successfully recaptured enough political territory, racist Democrats then enacted many of the so-called Jim Crow laws. This included passing state constitutions that denied blacks the right to vote, to serve on juries, or to hold office, as well as instituting poll taxes and segregation, among other policies that disproportionately affected black Americans. From the end of the Civil War to the end of the Civil Rights era and beyond, white supremacists continued to push for gun control in an attempt to disarm the black population. And for all the modern rhetoric about how we must not forget our history, here are a few more uncomfortable facts that you were conveniently never taught in school. In a speech in 1865, Frederick Douglass once prophesied that, while the legislatures of the South can take from the black man the right to keep and bear arms, the work of the abolitionists is not finished. During the 1950s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. kept a number of guns in his house, and even applied for a concealed carry permit following the bombing of his home in 1956. His application was denied, but armed guards remained stationed to protect King and his family. While MLK called for peaceful and nonviolent means of solving problems, he also understood the simple truth that black Americans were not always facing an adversary who would be as generous in spirit, and thus he took measures to defend himself and his loved ones against his oppressors. Malcolm X would often pose in pictures for Ebony magazine, wielding an M1 carbine semi-automatic. He preached that because the government was either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of blacks, they had to do so themselves by whatever means necessary. His view of the Second Amendment was that, quote, "It provides you and me with the right to own a rifle or a shotgun." The M1 carbine, it should be noted, was a standard-issue military rifle given to soldiers in World War II, Vietnam, and the Korean War, effectively making it a weapon of war, one which Malcolm X encouraged his followers to carry openly on the streets for their own protection against systemic racism. Clearly, Malcolm X understood the necessity of the right to bear arms, and the idea that predators do not like armed prey. Guns were also central to the identity of the Black Panthers. Founders Huey Newton and Bobby Seale made sure their followers were well-armed and well-trained, purchasing weapons with their own money raised from pamphlet sales. Their ranks even received special instruction from several sympathetic black Vietnam veterans in how to clean, use, and store their guns safely. Opposition to gun control was said to be the Black Panthers' primary motivation in their armed visit to the California State Capitol building, a move that shocked and horrified the political class at the time. In their view, the Civil Rights Movement had been not only a failure, but actively made things worse for black Americans, since many of the legal victories lacked sufficient teeth required to deliver true equality. This became evident in the fact that many blacks still suffered directly at the hands of the very police and military who were meant to uphold these laws. Thus, as Malcolm X proclaimed, blacks needed to arm and defend themselves, if only to serve as a show of force that they were not merely victims in waiting. That they needed to be visibly well armed as a deterrent and a brushback pitch against systemic racism. Again, predators don't like armed prey. The Black Panthers would go on to form their own neighborhood patrols and provide legal advice to any blacks who were stopped by police. In response, California legislatures sought to pass harsher and more punitive gun control measures of the very kind that created the Black Panthers in the first place. In April 1968, James Earl Ray, a virulent racist, shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was also assassinated. These two high-profile murders then gave gun control activists the push they needed to pass the first piece of federal gun control legislation in the United States. The Omnibus Crime Control and Street Safety Act of 1968, as well as the Gun Control Act of 1968. Since then, numerous other pieces of gun control law have been passed, and, surprise, surprise, they haven't done anything to stem the tide of gun violence in this country. If anything, inner-city gun murder remains the highest it's ever been, even among cities that have enacted strict gun control laws for decades. I will defer you to the Virtual SecDef's report on the statistics behind this, link in the description. Of course, guns don't just help blacks fight against white racists, tyrants, and criminals. They are also a great equalizer between men and women. The male body evolved to be physically stronger on average than the female body, thus enabling predatory men to take advantage of defenseless women, to rape, assault, and murder them. Unlike other ancient weapons, such as swords, knives, or bows and arrows, a gun is not dependent upon strength to deliver its killing power. A simple flick of the finger, and even a derringer can be lethal at a distance, which is compact enough that many women carried one around in their purses for self-defense. Whether by race or gender, guns are the great equalizers of mankind, forcing everyone who values their own life to the negotiating table. They are a technology that has made life fairer, more compassionate, more equitable, and more moral for a greater number of people, raising up the helpless and bringing down their oppressors. Today, we see the racist Democrats in Congress once again pushing for more gun control restrictions, using the same tired arguments their racist predecessors have for decades, with the predictable result being that it will make blacks and women less safe than they are now. That by disarming their prey, they open up the door for predators and oppressors, criminals and tyrants, to further abuse, enslave, rape, and murder them. All this from the party that would have you believe their primary aim is to protect and elevate oppressed minorities. This from the self-proclaimed party of blacks and of women, when the real question the Democrats should be asking themselves is why do they hate black women so much that they want to see them dead? Because that's what will happen if you let them take your guns away. Those who would proclaim that Black Lives Matter should likewise declare that black guns matter, because guns are ultimately what guarantee your lives and your liberty. The only reason the government obeys us and remains our faithful servant is because they know there lies a gun behind every blade of grass. And even our mortal enemies abroad admit that such a people cannot be conquered by force. However, at the end of the day, the government cannot be relied upon to protect you in all instances, and thus you must arm yourself by whatever means necessary, by whatever means you yourself decide is in your own best interests and that of your family, whether that's an AR-15, a Glock 22, a can of mace, a wooden stick, or nothing at all. The choice should be in your hands, not those of some racist lying bureaucrat who views you as their stolen property. As long as you bear arms for peaceful purposes and for blameless self-defense, you have nothing to fear from my administration. In fact, I will fully, totally, and completely support you in this right, 1000%. Gun control is racist, it's sexist, it's anti-American, it's anti-human. Those who promote it are either naive sheep or predatory wolves in sheep's clothing, exploiting your compassion, your kindness, and your fear. Many of you who still fear guns have probably never held or fired one yourself. I'm not saying you necessarily have to. That is a personal choice. But understand that your own ignorance and lack of experience and lack of exposure does not grant you the right to deprive others of their lawfully held property or their ability to defend themselves as they see fit. If you wish to declaw yourself and remain a victim in waiting to be picked off by predators, that's your own business. But you have no right to demand that of the rest of us, and that if you tried, you would very quickly find yourselves thrown to the wolves. Understand that, in promoting gun control laws, you are only hurting your brothers and sisters, even though in your heart you genuinely believe that you're helping them. Visuals are important to persuasion, as is contrast. So in contrast to the racists in office who are afraid of inanimate objects and who would have you share that same fear, here's a video of Halle Berry training for her role in John Wick 3. Besides being a total badass, do you think anyone is going to try and mess with her, having seen this clip? Does she look like a victim to you? Or does she look like a strong, independent black woman, capable of protecting herself and those around her? Cynics will say that she's had a lot of training to get this good, and that's true. Rather than take that away from her, wouldn't you like to be this skilled as well? Wouldn't you like to be that awesome? To look this cool? Moreover, Halle Berry doesn't just play some random gangbanger in John Wick. Contrary to the stereotype of blacks as criminals, she's actually one of the protagonists of the film. One of the good guys, helping John take down the bad guys and deliver justice to an international criminal organization in spectacular fashion. In other words, she uses guns in the service of being a hero and a role model to fight injustice while proving she's every bit as capable as her white male counterpart. There is true equality between her and her co-star Keanu Reeves. And the best part is that it's conveyed through actions rather than words and slogans. She didn't have to hold up a sign or chant, "We have nothing to lose but our chains." She didn't have to virtue signal to prove that she was equal. She just went out and did what others did, achieving the same results through merit and hard work. Show, don't tell. And everyone's so happy and proud and welcoming of her as they cheer her on, in stark contrast to the angry, bitter, humorless disdain of your common left-wing activist. I know it can be hard for some of you to imagine, but maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't see so much inner-city crime or need to rely so heavily on the cops that you think are all racists, if instead, black people had the ability and the tools to police their own neighborhoods. Maybe you wouldn't have to say all cops are bastards, or complain about police brutality, if black people were well armed and knew how to shoot back at their oppressors, as well as the gangbanger down the street who's smashing windows and setting black-owned businesses on fire. Maybe racist thugs would think twice about targeting you if they saw the .22 strapped to your hip. Maybe you ladies wouldn't be afraid to walk down a dark alley at night if you could feel confident in being able to handle yourself against predatory men and actually do something about systemic rape culture, instead of just declaring that we should teach men not to rape. Newsflash, they already know. They just don't care. If they don't care about laws against rape and murder, What makes you think they'll care about gun control? Certainly, the Democrats know this, which is why they seek to keep you disarmed. Because they don't want you fighting back, or defending yourselves, or becoming strong and independent. Because if you did, what would you need them for? They don't want you fighting back against your oppressors, because they are your oppressors. Gun control is sexist. Gun control is racist. Gun control keeps you subservient and in fear. It keeps you dependent on others for your own protection. It keeps you enslaved to your political masters. The right to bear arms is a universal human right, belonging to every individual, regardless of race, gender, color, or creed. It is a right that belongs to you, and so long as I am your virtual president, I shall preserve and protect it to the fullest extent, as I have sworn an oath to do. Gun control has no home here. In fact, it's high time we start rolling out the big guns and drawing down on several of those more onerous restrictions. It's time we restore our republic and the right to bear arms to their full honor and dignity once again. In this way, we shall make America greater than ever, and build a future of freedom for all.